Terrorism has become a major challenge to socioeconomic development in many African countries. This has spurred research on the extent to which terrorism affects economic growth. But an area that's been less examined is the influence of military expenditure on the relationship between terrorism and economic growth in Africa. In an effort to mitigate the impact of terrorism on the economy, African countries have increased military spending. Research shows that military expenditure in Africa had increased by 91% since 2005. There is a way in which the increase in military expenditure can mitigate terrorism's negative effect on economic growth. This is through the effect of increased counter-terrorism. It improves security and leads to the reduction in economic uncertainty, the restoration of economic activity, and ultimately increased investment. So in today's video, we will look at the top 15 African countries with the lowest military budget in 2022. Let's start. 15. Ghana, $289 million. Military expenditure in Ghana increased to $298 million in 2021 from $239 million in 2020. Ghanaian defense spending has risen by 2.7% annually from $177 million in 2016 to $289 million by 2022. This spending is spurred by a need to equip the armed forces to counter regional terrorist threats, peacekeeping operations, and the fight against maritime piracy and drug trafficking. Ghana's military budget averaged $87 million from 1958 until 2021, reaching an all-time high of $337 million in 2012 and a record low of $1 million in 1967. The West African sub-region in particular is currently experiencing a surge in activities by armed groups. A significant presence of Islamic State and al-Qaeda-allied militia groups in Chad, Nigeria, Niger, and Mali pose security threats that justify increased Ghanaian defense spending. 14. Sudan, $287 million. Military expenditure in Sudan decreased to $375 million in 2021 from $934 million in 2020. Its military budget decreased in 2022 to $287 million. The continuing legacy of authoritarian governments and mismanagement has left the Sudanese economy in shambles and contributed to resurgent violence across the country. Sudan's military seized power from a transitional civilian government that was working to end 3 decades of oppression and authoritarian rule. The country has been on this downward trajectory since the military's October 25 coup d'etat last year. Since that time, the security services have been methodically rebuilding the security Islamist government that ruled for the last 30 years under former dictator Omar al-Bashir. Military expenditure in Sudan averaged $589 million from 1956 until 2022, reaching an all-time high of $4.3 billion in 2017 and a record low of less than $1 million in 1956. 13. Niger, $287 million. Niger, an ally of France and the United States in the fight against Islamic State and al-Qaeda-linked extremists in the Sahel, is one of the world's poorest countries, but has ramped up military spending in the last few years. Military expenditure in Niger decreased to $202 million in 2021 from $238 million in 2020. In 2022, its military defense budget increased to $287 million. Niger allocates 1.3% of its GDP for military purposes. The popularity of the military was enhanced by its quick turnover to civilian rule in 2010 and its role in improving security along Niger's borders. Niger's security is affected by Islamist terror groups in the region, such as al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and unstable neighbors, such as Boko Haram militants in Nigeria. The country has become a smuggling route for weapons from Libya, reaching al-Qaeda militants in the Sahara, with thousands of gunmen and tons of weapons and ammunition flowing south, mainly to Mali. Military expenditure in Niger averaged $62 million from 1975 until 2022, reaching an all-time high of $287 million in 2022 and a record low of $7 million in 1975. 12. Gabon. $281 million. Military expenditure in Gabon decreased to $202 million in 2021 from $238 million in 2020. Then in 2022, its military defense budget increased to $281 million. Gabon has traditionally been a stable, relatively wealthy country, and this is reflected in its armed forces. Although Gabon's military is fairly small, it is a professional and well-organized force. Military expenditure in Gabon averaged $112 million from 1967 until 2022, reaching an all-time high of $311 million in 2021 and a record low of $1 million in 2007. 11. South Sudan. $276 million. After decades of war and the first challenging years of independence, South Sudan is continuing to develop the nascent structures and processes of a new state. Although the country is potentially wealthy, the majority of its citizens are poor, with limited or no access to basic services, including security. However, the security sector accounts for the greatest part of the national budget. Military expenditure in South Sudan increased to $170 million in 2021 from $128 million in 2020. In 2022, the Southern Parliament dramatically increased its budget for military expenses for the Sudan People's Liberation Army to $251 million. Military expenditure in South Sudan averaged $600 million from 2006 until 2022, reaching an all-time high of $1.3 billion in 2014 and a record low of $72 million in 2017. 10. Zambia. $251 million. Military expenditure in Zambia increased to $282 million in 2021 from $212 million in 2020. In 2022, Zambia spent $251 million on its military, which amounted to 1.8% of the country's GDP this year. Military expenditure in Zambia averaged $189 million from 1984 until 2022, reaching an all-time high of $443 million in 2014 and a record low of $37 million in 1996. 9. Mauritania. $251 million. Military expenditure in Mauritania increased to $230 million in 2021 from $198 million in 2020. In 2022, the military expenditure for Mauritania increased to $251 million. Since a spate of terrorist attacks in the early 2000s, including a 2008 attack on a military base in the country's north that resulted in the deaths of 12 soldiers, the Mauritanian government has increased the defense budget and military equipment acquisitions, enhanced military training, heightened security cooperation with its neighbors and the international community, and built up the military special operations and civil military affairs forces. The government hopes to beef up its military and national security budget to better defend its borders and combat terrorism. Meanwhile, military expenditure in Mauritania averaged $73 million from 1985 until 2022, reaching an all-time high of $251 million in 2021 and a record low of $1 million in 2004. Take a break. Go ahead and hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. That way, you'll be updated anytime we upload interesting videos. 8. Mozambique. $140 million. Since gaining its independence, Mozambique has seen its defense budget decline rapidly. Military expenditure in Mozambique decreased to $248 million in 2021 from $288 million in 2020 and in 2022. Its government approved a $140 million military budget. The equipment the Mozambique military currently owns has been poorly maintained and, in most cases, is non-functional. There is very little money for spare parts and maintenance. There are no indications that the government can fix this problem because it relies heavily on donor support to fund its military, and donors are very hesitant to directly finance the military. Military expenditure in Mozambique averaged $100 million from 1977 until 2022, reaching an all-time high of $288 million in 2020 and a record low of $33 million in 1995. The budget for its military is not expected to rise because of the lack of a perceived threat against the sovereignty of Mozambique and overarching economic problems throughout Mozambique's government. 7. Zimbabwe, $117 million. Zimbabwe spent $117 million on its military in 2022, which amounted to 1.1% of the country's GDP this year. Though Zimbabwe's military expenditure fluctuated substantially in recent years, it tended to increase. Military expenditure in Zimbabwe increased to $65 million in 2021 from $8 million in 2020. In recent years, Zimbabwe spent about 70% of its defense budget on personnel salaries and allowances. This seems a common pattern in African countries. In most African militaries, an overwhelming proportion of the budget goes to salaries and personnel allowances. Typically, very small portions of the military budget are allocated to research, intelligence, infrastructure, and capital costs. However, military expenditure in Zimbabwe averaged $269 million from 1965 until 2022, reaching an all-time high of $677 million in 2002 and a record low of $8 million in 2020. 6. Madagascar, $110 million. After its armed forces were formed in 1975, the cost of maintaining the military establishment became a greater burden on the national budget. Military expenditure in Madagascar increased to $99 million in 2021 from $87 million in 2020. In 2022, the defense budget increased to $110 million. Military expenditure in Madagascar averaged $46 million from 1960 until 2022, reaching an all-time high of $103 million in 2008 and a record low of $1.6 million in 1960. 5. Eritrea, $105 million. In 2022, military expenditure for Eritrea was $105 million. Underlining its relative strength in comparison to all other African countries, Eritrea unquestionably spends a larger portion of its gross domestic product on defense. Eritrea is divided into 4 military regions. Its armed forces are built from the Liberation Army that won independence. The official tasks of the armed forces include strengthening the country against external attack, maintaining border security, and developing social cohesion. After independence, its defense budget was $88 million. A looming war with Ethiopia induced apprehension in the country, and Eritrea ratcheted up its defense expenditures, devoting an astronomical 38.5% of GDP to its defense budget, amounting to a total of $271 million 3 years after independence. Following the easing of tensions, defense spending decreased to 25.7% of its budget in 2002, and only 19.4% of its budget in 2003. Military expenditure in Eritrea averaged $165 million from 1993 until 2022, reaching an all-time high of $272 million on December 1999 and a record low of $80 million on December 1994. 4. Somalia, $61 million. In Somalia, conflict among clans has enhanced terrorism, which has destroyed the Somalian economy. This has led to severe malnutrition, particularly among children. The default response to increased insurgency and acts of terrorism is to up military spending. Somalia's military budget for 2022 is $61 million. During the first decade after independence, military expenditure increased at an average rate of more than 9% a year. With the formation of the Somali army, the cost of maintaining the military establishment became the largest item in the national budget. Somalia imported approximately $660 million in arms. Defense costs consistently exceeded the combined amounts budgeted for health and education. Somalia's new leaders aim to train and equip a professional army of about 28,000 soldiers. They need support from the international community because the government is not in a financial position to pay their salaries and arm their military. 3. Central African Republic, $41 million. Years after a coup that plunged the country into chaos and led to the Central African Armed Forces dissolution, the military has re-established a presence in every major urban center of the Central African Republic. The Central African Republic does not have the financial resources to maintain its current personnel. Military expenditure in the Central African Republic decreased to $43 million in 2021 from $44 million in 2020. This is a change of 2.6%. In 2022, its defense budget dropped to $41 million. This lack of funding for defense is because the government can no longer allocate deployment bonuses to encourage new recruits to stay in the hinterland. In the past, the French strongly influenced military operations in the Central African Republic. Approximately $30 million was spent annually on the military in the early 1990s, but the equipment are dated and of poor quality. Military expenditure in the Central African Republic averaged $28 million from 1991 until 2022, reaching an all-time high of $51 million in 2010 and a record low of $10 million in 1994. 2. Sierra Leone, $19 million. Military expenditure in Sierra Leone increased to $27 million in 2021 from $22 million in 2020. In 2022, its defense budget further decreased to $19 million. The ratio of military expenditure to the gross domestic product in Sierra Leone decreased by 0.2% since the previous year. As a result, the ratio in Sierra Leone saw its lowest number in 2020 at 0.6%. Military expenditure in Sierra Leone averaged $16 million from 1961 until 2022, reaching an all-time high of $48 million in 2014 and a record low of $1.9 million in 1961. 1. Liberia, $12 million. Liberians remain very vulnerable to heightened insecurity, including external aggression. Military expenditure in Liberia is the lowest in the African continent in 2022. Its military increased to $14 million in 2021 from $12 million in 2020, and in 2022, its defense budget decreased back to $12 million. Liberia has allocated half of its annual national budget to defense and security requirements. This is an indication that no relief is in sight for the ongoing conflict, which has maimed, killed, and displaced thousands in the country. The ratio of military expenditure to the gross domestic product in Liberia decreased by 0.1% since the previous year. Meanwhile, military expenditure in Liberia averaged $13 million from 1965 until 2022, reaching an all-time high of $43 million in 1982 and a record low of $2.7 million in 1965. Military expenditure is a relevant policy variable in reducing the negative effect of terrorism on economic growth in Africa. Many developing countries do not give high priority to gathering and disseminating basic statistics about their countries. One of these aspects is the security sector. Many countries regard the information in this sector as being sensitive and essential to their national security, and thus avoid providing it at least in any detail. Let us know your thoughts on the defense budget in Africa in the comments below. Like our video if you enjoyed it. Also, if you are really interested in knowing more about Africa, then subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon to get notified when we upload new content like this. Thank you for watching and see you in our next video.